Hello there, year 13. This is a Mr. Has a Party with a video about the Four Noble Truths. Um, because, yeah, one of the topics I think that perhaps we didn't cover or didn't look at in great depth was this question: which of the Four Noble Truths is the most important? Now, this video is going to basically go through arguments that you could use in an essay of this kind. You know, you could get an essay just like this, or you could get one that says, you know, the first noble truth is the most important truth, discuss, or the second or the third or the fourth or whatever, anything like that. Now, one of the reasons why perhaps we haven't discussed this issue a lot is because it's a bit of a silly question, and that's probably what you're thinking. And that's sometimes the problem with in Buddhism, is that the questions, some of the sort of questions you might have to answer in essays are a bit odd, because let's face it, the Four Noble Truths are kind of a self-contained unit. They basically all fit together. You need all four together, otherwise it don't make any sense. And we'll come back to that. But you've just got basically what the essay is trying to do. An essay like this is trying to give you an explanation, an opportunity to show off the fact that you know about the different noble truths, and you can explain why they're important, and you can kind of talk about them in relation to each other. So let's just go through each noble truth and see what I thought you could say about it. Okay, first noble truth: dukkha, of course, is suffering. So, you know, you've got to be able to say in your perils, and I'm going to go through all four noble truths, but it all depends on how the question is worded, or how what structure you'd want to use. But for each one, I'm going to basically be able to say why you could say it's the most important, why you'd say it's not the most important. So I might say dukkha is the most important because it's only by understanding that the world is full of suffering and the nature of this suffering that Buddhists can overcome suffering. So, the whole point of Buddhism is to overcome suffering, but you can only overcome it if you know that it is there and you know what the nature of it is. And this is an opportunity to show your understanding of the three forms of suffering. Because what I would probably say is that, everyone knows that there is suffering in terms of dukkha, but what's a uniquely Buddhist teaching is the second two forms of suffering. Viparinama dukkha, the idea that even good experiences bring suffering because they're impermanent, and then samskara dukkha, the idea that somehow there's something dissatisfying with life because you never kind of reach this final or permanent goal. So I would talk about those kind of things to trying to get the idea, like, this is important because you have to understand this stuff before you can do anything in Buddhism. If you don't understand that stuff, then you'll get nowhere. You could also use that. The Buddha said, I teach only two things: suffering and the end of suffering. Shows how important dukkha is. Reasons to disagree. Well, one thing is that focusing on dukkha makes Buddhism sound depressing and fatalistic. Fatalistic is the idea that you just have to accept the way things are. And sometimes people seem to find Buddhism very depressing because they kind of say, oh, Buddhism just says the world is full of suffering, there's nothing you can do about it. But actually, that's not true. Buddhism is wildly optimistic in some ways, because Buddhism says you can get rid of all suffering and reach a state where there's no suffering whatsoever. Without the other noble truths, then you would never know that. So that's one reason to say it's not the most important. The second noble truth, of course, is tanha, or craving, being the cause of suffering. So why is it the most important? The second noble truth identifies the reasons for suffering. Within Buddhism, identifying the cause of something is important because it will tell you how you can stop the thing from coming into being. This is the teaching of dependent origination. Dependent origination is a key teaching in Buddhism, and that is, everything has a cause. When the cause is not there, then that thing doesn't come into existence. So with suffering, the idea is, well, if you want to get rid of suffering, it's vitally important to know what caused that suffering, because that way you can step in and defeat the cause and therefore get rid of the suffering. And so for Buddhism, knowing the cause of something is all important. Here again, it's a good opportunity to then show your understanding of the three forms of suffering, of craving, that is kama tanha, bhava tanha, vibhava tanha, and show that you can understand, here's how these things lead to suffering. You could then say that, the second noble truth is then the kind of basis for the next noble truth, because once you understand what the cause of suffering is, it's then that you'll understand what a life without suffering will be like. That is, it will be when you've got your mind to have no craving. And you can also understand that the Noble Eightfold Path begins to take shape when you understand the second noble truth, because basically you're starting to think about, well, what can I do in order to get rid of craving? Reasons to disagree. One reason, this is a little bit dodgy, this argument, but you think you can make it, and again, arguments are good if they help you show your understanding. It might be said that a narrow focus on craving may be seen as a problem because elsewhere the Buddha gives a more sophisticated breakdown of the three causes of suffering. That's the three poisons. So the Buddha elsewhere says, well, the reason we're suffering is because of greed, hatred, and ignorance. If you just focus on craving, that word can make it sound like greed is the only one that really matters, when actually it's all three of these together. However, I've put in square brackets underneath this that a good argument against this, that the Buddha really saw the three poisons as just a kind of more in-depth understanding of craving. Craving is said to be made up of the three poisons. So craving is made up of greed, hatred, and ignorance. So, that's a debatable one. Another reason to disagree, you could say that while it tells us the cause of suffering, it doesn't really on its own give us any practical advice about how to get over suffering. That's found in the Eightfold Path, so it's not as important as that. That could be an argument. Okay, third noble truth is, of course, nirvana. Why is it the most important? I would say nirvana is most important because unless nirvana is real and achievable, then the Buddhist path makes no sense. Without the possibility of reaching nirvana and overcoming all suffering, then even if we accepted the first two truths, we may conclude that the best way of life is one of hedonism, where we try to get as much pleasure as possible, even though all pleasures are ultimately impermanent. Here, you could kind of go into a bit of debate between the hedonism of like Bentham, utilitarianism, and the Buddha's approach to life. Because I'd say that if you think about the debate we talked about between Buddhism and utilitarianism, then the utilitarianism criticism of Buddhism kind of makes sense if there's no such thing as nirvana, because utilitarians say yes, of course they know that everything in life is impermanent, but unless you think there's something called nirvana, then that's the best life you're going to get, is just have as much pleasure as you can get, enjoy yourself as much as you can. Yes, all your pleasures are impermanent, but you can never get anything better than that. So if once your pleasures go, you just try and get more pleasure and go and so on for the rest of your life. Nirvana changes the game completely and makes things completely different, because nirvana, the concept of nirvana says, well, actually there is something you can have better than just a life of impermanent pleasures. You can reach a state of permanent, complete happiness. And so, yeah, I think really important, because unless you believe that, then you would never live the Buddhist life. Reasons to disagree. It could be argued that the concept of nirvana is confusing and hard to define, to the point that it may be off-putting to people. So the whole idea of nirvana might be said to be so odd or so hard to explain that it's just kind of off-putting to people, and therefore not the most important part of Buddhism, perhaps to share with someone at the beginning of their journey. So David R. Loy says that the Buddhist tradition displays multivocality about the nature of nirvana. He basically says that there's different ways of saying what nirvana is in the Pali Canon. And you could just say, well, doesn't that mean that the Buddhist nirvana is just confusing, basically? Rupert Gethin says that nirvana is simply impossible for us to understand. He says it's like neither, what's the two things he says? Annihilationism or eternalism, and therefore it's not. Nirvana is not a kind of case of it's a permanent existence, but it's also not a nothingness. And that means that if you get to nirvana after you die, you neither exist nor don't exist. Well, this raises the issue of whether nirvana is a coherent or plausible concept. Perhaps it just makes no sense. Okay, last one. The fourth noble truth is most important. So this is the Eightfold Path. So nice and simple. The Eightfold Path shows in practical terms how a Buddhist should live their life in order to reach nirvana. It's the only one of the Four Noble Truths dedicated to how Buddhists should live their life, to what they should actually do. All the other three are just kind of ideas. This is like, what do you do? So here you could use this as an opportunity to show your understanding of the importance of the three sections of the Eightfold Path: morality, meditation, and wisdom, and to talk about how those three sections of the path lead to overcoming the three poisons or overcoming suffering, and then what Buddhists would do to put them into practice. You could argue there's no use in knowing that we are suffering or what the cause of suffering is without knowing how to escape from suffering. Reasons to disagree. Well, one is that Mahayana Buddhists would agree with the first of the three noble truths. They would agree that there's suffering, that the cause is craving, and that we need to get to nirvana, but they don't actually follow the Eightfold Path, because they're going on the Bodhisattva path and trying to become Buddhas. Then they follow the six perfections, leading to Buddhahood. So that's a reason to say, well, not all Buddhists actually follow this Eightfold Path. Secondly, you could say, I think this is quite a weak argument, but the Eightfold Path is just a practical outworking of the Second Noble Truth. In other words, you know, it's basically just, we've already seen you need to get rid of craving. That's the fundamental thing. And this is just telling you, well, how do you in practical terms get rid of craving? So you could say maybe the Second Noble Truth is fundamentally more important because this is just kind of like something that flows from the Second Noble Truth, if that makes sense. Okay, there's your arguments. Last thing, in my conclusion, I would expect something like this. I actually took this sentence straight from a mark scheme on a question of this kind from a previous exam. It said this: all Four Noble Truths are, it said students may want to argue this: all Four Noble Truths are equally important, as the teaching as a whole shows the true nature of life or samsara, suffering, and the escape from that suffering and from samsara. So in other words, I would expect you in your perils to be kind of arguing these different truths against each other, but then I would expect a conclusion at the end where you basically said the thing is that even if you came down on the side of one of the Noble Truths as the most important, I'd still want some recognition of this, that really the Four Noble Truths is a organic whole. It works together. You can't act that none of the truths really make sense outside of the context of the other three, so therefore it's really impossible, I would say, to definitively say one noble truth is more important than the other. And that's fine to conclude at the end, and I think a good conclusion at the end. You just have to make sure that you've got things to say, like we've already said, about why, even though it's a bit of a silly question, why some people might think some of the noble truths are more important than others. Okay, hope that makes sense. Thank you.